This is Show Up as a Leader, a show from People Forward Network, helping you maximize your positive impact on the world by becoming your best, fully authentic self. Hey, everyone. Let me just tell you that I think there's going to be a lot of times throughout this conversation that you are going to be nodding your head going, oh yeah, oh, I see that. Oh, that makes sense. And I got so much of that when I talked to Kimberly Spencer. She is an incredible fellow lover of sparkle. She's an award-winning high performance coach, TEDx speaker, Amazon best-selling author, and business owner. And she has such a rich background that has been featured all over the place, from Chicken Soup for the Soul, ESPN, NPR, CNBC, Forbes, etc. And we talked a lot about this idea of story and plagiarized stories on the individual and the collective organizational level. We had a great conversation around drama and how it distracts us from our purpose and what are we tolerating. We talked a lot about the power of truly owning our story and owning it from a place of neutrality, and what does that look like. We talked about how do we actually get back in alignment, again, individually and collectively as an organization, when we are not in alignment with our values or who we want to be. And there's just a lot of nice synergy back and forth between us as an individual, collectively as an organization. And I think that you're going to, again, have a lot of things in this conversation where you're going to find yourself resonating, going, oh, yep, that sounds like me. I know I was jotting down some notes for myself that I took away from this conversation that were just really good reminders that I'm going to lean on to help me get back in alignment with myself when my own self-limiting stories start showing up. So I would love to hear what you end up taking away from this conversation. And her new book is coming out when this episode comes out, so go get it. All right, Kimberly, I am so excited to have this sparkly conversation with you. As we learned, we're both a fan of sparkle. So I am just going to dive right in. And one of the things that I want to just start with is talking about your take on the power of story. And why I want to start with this is I think so many of us, in the spirit of holding ourselves back from showing up as a leader, so many of us in the spirit of not creating human workplaces, of not letting our sparkle shine individually and collectively, we don't share our stories. We hide that part of ourselves. And one of the stats that I lean on a lot is that stories are 22 times more powerful than facts and figures alone. And I know I've gotten away from it sometimes. Like when we were writing our second book, they were pushing me to tell more of my story. I'm like, no one wants to hear that. And what you realize is that the people we resonate the most with, even though we haven't experienced their exact story, but that's how our brains work. We make sense of our experiences through story. And so I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, because I know I've lost track of that at certain points in my life and have gotten back to it. And I know other people in other businesses. And this is such a critical thing. So talk to us about the power that you see in both individually and collectively owning and telling our story in an effective way.
I think the best way is to tell you a story.
Yes, let's do
it. In order to give to go real meta and go into an example, but also a demonstration. Because if I were to just lay into the facts and the figures and how, just me even saying like, can I just tell you a story, or I'm going to tell you a story, suddenly that actually releases a little bit of dopamine, a little bit of oxytocin. It enhances, it turns short-term memory into long-term memory. So those are little fun facts and figures, but they don't resonate and deeply land unless you understand the power of your story. And humans, we're wired to connect with story. And I've been obsessed with story since I was a child. Like, I would create these little fantasy worlds and just live in the safety of my imagination, because growing up, our home was pretty chaotic. I grew up with two entrepreneur parents. I watched my parents grow a business from nothing to very, very successful, all while my dad was a highly functioning addict. And I use story to escape, but I also use story because I grew up with seeing this beautiful dichotomy in human behavior. And in the stories that I was seeing play out in my life, and I saw a story of self-deprecation, a story of blame, of shame, of victimization play out that would result in my dad coming home drunk. I also would see a story of redemption, a story of hope, a story of faith, which would result in my dad coming home sober. So I lived in this paradox of multiple fathers in one body, and seeing how our stories that we tell ourselves and our stories that we project out and that we share with others either reinforce the neural pathways or they create new neural pathways of possibility. And it was in my TED Talk that I said, like, that your story, it is a testimony for the possibility of what's possible. Now, sometimes the possibility can be negative. Sometimes the possibility can be like, oh, that's a shitstorm that we don't want to see. But it also can be potential. It also can be our immense, infinite human potential to achieve that which we want to achieve, depending upon what is a story that we are saying to ourselves, what is a story that we're saying to others, and what are the stories that we are allowing in our environment as well.
There's so much in that we could unpack. And I'll just say the first thing that comes to my mind when you talk about, our stories do have such a power to shape our experiences and how we recall something, how we move through something. And I wonder, I just am making this connection now, but I'm thinking about research from Mark Brackett and Brene Brown and others, even looking at the power of the story of language as it relates to our emotional literacy and us being able to process through things in our life. In this case, I'll say particularly hard things, like growing up with a parent who's, an addict and whatnot. And if we don't have accurate language to label and name and describe what we're experiencing, we can't ask for the help we need. We don't move through it. And what that brought up for me as you were saying that is I think about all of the leaders and teams that I work with. And one of the exercises we have them do is we have them go back and understand like where those neural pathways got laid, like where that story got started. And newsflash, folks, it gets started in those first 10 to 15 years of your life as that programming in our brain is getting downloaded. But it's that falsehood. It's the, oh, something happened to them. Like, and then they created a story that's full of shame and blame of I'm not good enough. Or, you know what? If I am somehow perfect, then I can avoid judgment. Or if I'm in control, I can prevent bad stuff from happening. And we all do it, right? And so sometimes we create stories that are of rising above and perseverance, right? And sometimes we create these stories that keep us really safe and small. And I think until we lean into that and get curious about it and own it, it hinders us, doesn't it?
100%. And you said one of my favorite words is you have to own it. And what does it mean to own your story? And I had to go on a deep dive with that when I was 19 years old. And by then I had seen the stories play out of addiction and shame and blame and victimization. And given some of my experiences as a child, I had very valid reasons to have the same story of shame, blame, and victimization. And that transpired into a 10-year battle with bulimia. And it was when I was 19. And first of all, I changed my environment. So I moved out of my family home because you cannot outgrow the story of your environment. So often in the ecosystem that you've grown up in, they see you as the attachments of who you were. And when you're trying to evolve beyond that, that is where the environment can hold you back. You've heard it said probably crabs in a bucket, or in Australia, it's called tall poppy syndrome. And that's where all the poppies, all the crabs want to keep you at that same level. And it's not intentional and it's not malicious, but it's that environment. So I removed myself from that environment, and being in the space of being in healing, I had to learn how to own my own story. And I had all the reasons to blame my dad for all the things. And I was very, very angry. And I had a moment where I realized like it was never my father shoving my finger down my throat. That was me. That was my choice. It was never him force feeding me food. That was me. That was my choice. And it's a really sucky, uncomfortable conversation to have when you are in the space of really owning your shit and seeing it. And it's not covered in sparkles, and it's just brown and ugly. And you see it and you own it, because you're no longer avoiding it with the sparkles that we can lather on our own shit stories with, victimization, because sometimes victimization can be glorified. And I want to make a very clear point that there's a very big difference between a victimization story and an experience where you were actually a victim. Big difference. And if you carry that story of being a victim, it will impact every single one of your relationships, every single one of your jobs, every single one of your bosses, every single, the way you lead as a leader. It will impact every single area of your life if you choose to hang on to that story. And when you choose to own your story, that's when there's a level of self-acceptance of that story, where you're able to see and smell your own flavor of bullshit. As Laura Ora talks about on our podcast, Communication Queens, she said that phrase, and I said, I love that phrase, because when you can see and smell that your own flavor, and you're like, oh, I see how I like to color my story with the shade of being either the villain, the victim, or the hero, where you swoop in, and that's the very much the role of the codependent. And when you can flip that story to see, wow, I'm taking ownership of my own story, and how did I co-create this story? How did I allow for the story to shape me over the years? And do I like the way that it's shaping me? Because I realized that if I continued to blame my father for my results, then I would have to also blame him for my recovery. And I didn't want him to take the credit, quite frankly. I was like, I really wanted to take the credit myself for healing with no psychological or medical intervention. And that's the power of when you actually own your story, is you own the mistakes, you own what was. You can't go back and change the past. There's a great principle in psychology, and I just referenced it, which is the drama triangle, where it's the victim, the villain, and the hero. And when you own your story, the victim role automatically shifts into the creator role, where suddenly you start to become a creator of your circumstances. The villain role shifts into the challenger role, where suddenly you start to disrupt the systems that were maybe the generational trauma, maybe the history of financial codependency. You start to be the disruptor. You start to be the one who breaks down those systems, and you are the one who changes the game for everyone else after. And then there's the hero role, which is typically the codependent, versus the codependent flips into the empower role of the coach, the guide, the facilitator, where you're pioneering the path, you're helping support people on the path, but you also have healthy boundaries as to how far you will go, that you understand that every person has sovereignty and autonomy for their own results.
It's so funny. I was literally yesterday having conversations. So we do a courageous leadership series once a quarter, but we were talking about drama at work, and we were talking about Cartman's drama triangle and the three different roles. And you're spot on. And I think, you add with the hero, it also though is that's the person that it's the temporary alleviating of discomfort or suffer or discharging it. So yeah, it can be the codependency, or it's the, you know what, I'm the person who's going to swoop in and fix it for you, rather than sitting back and watch you struggle through discomfort. It's the give somebody a fish sandwich rather than teaching them to fish type of thing. And so I love all that, because I think that, going back to story, good stories love drama, right? We love to have a bad guy. We love to have a hero. We love to have, a victim. I mean, like, we thrive off of it, but it's dysfunctional, right? And so, and it's dysfunctional on an individual level. I mean, I made a conscious decision last year. There was just too much drama that was like orbiting me, and I'm like, I'm cutting drama from my life as much as I possibly can, which meant that in my social circles, there were some relationships that I was like, oh my God, this person can never take responsibility for themselves. And I'm just like, I don't want that energy. Right. But then even like in working stuff, it's looking at, you know what, I'm not going to say this person, I'm going to call them to greatness. Or when someone else is stuck in drama, I'm not going to be crass about it, but in a loving way, like, call them on it. Drama is showing up everywhere. I think because our world is so chaotic that it just like, it's like gasoline on a fire. It fuels it. And then, like, to your point, then the stories, rather than us recognizing them, owning them, and choosing a path that serves us and others well, we get sucked into or owned by our stories rather than us owning them. Is that making sense to you?
100%. I completely believe that drama is just a way of distraction. Like, it distracts us from our purpose. It distracts us from our sovereignty. It distracts us from our ability to create, because as the opposite of anxiety, which is stimulated by drama, it's the drama that we have going on inside our heads, like all the fears and all the things that could go wrong. The opposite of that is creativity. But we cannot create if we're distracted by all the drama that's going on in our heads or in the environment around us. And thus, yes, I love what you did in removing. It's like sometimes there is a loving removal process, or people end up just removing themselves. Like, I remember when I was right before I got married. And sometimes this happens in like large seasons of transition, whether it's like getting married, having a baby, starting a new job, starting a new business. When there's those big life transitions, suddenly your environment shifts in a way that people will kind of clear the path. And I was about to get married, and I was in the middle of a buyout negotiations for my e-commerce company. And meanwhile, then I had a bridesmaid who did not like the fact that I wouldn't let her bring a +1, because we had the rule that it was, you could bring a +1 if you were going to, if you were married or like in a long-term committed relationship. Or I said, like, if you meet the love of your life, but I just don't want Joe Schmo that you just met the other day because you would just want to date. And she was not happy with that. And we ended up like replacing her as a bridesmaid. And that drama cleared its way out. And same with the drama that I had with my former business partner. It kind of made this path of clearing, because the universe abhors a vacuum. And when those vacuums are created, it's because you are going to that next level, because you are realigning with a more sovereign path where you're not being distracted by the drama over here or the drama over there. And there is the power of the drama of the story. But there's a difference between the drama of the story of your past that's like great for telling on podcasts versus the drama that you're currently allowing in your life, because we all get what we tolerate. And if you're tolerating a level of drama in your life, then that's where you get to question and ask yourself, what is the story whether in my past or current, that I'm telling myself as to why I need this drama in my life? What is this drama actually distracting me from doing that may be more purposeful, more impactful, more creative?
I love all that. And I think, yeah, there is a difference of, hey, it's a good story of his happened to me in the past, but yeah, are you getting sucked into it now? And I think this is what I see a lot of times in workplaces. And I love how you put it, of what is it keeping you from? Because like when I see with teams, it's so easy to get distracted. Well, they're not doing their part, or they wait till the last minute, or they don't communicate with us, or they don't tell us this. I mean, you start to pay attention and you will see it everywhere. Right. And it's like, okay, well, and so a lot of times from my experience, that drama is preventing people from having to take responsibility and show up as an accountable person and own, like, maybe I wasn't as good at this, or maybe I need to be more patient, or maybe, whatever it might be, or maybe there's someone that I don't really care for, but right. So it's easier for me to sit back and blame and judgment rather than, God, what if I, it's hard to hate people close up. What if I leaned in and got to know them as a person? It doesn't mean you're going to be best friends, but it might be harder to sit in judgment, right? When you know a little bit more. And so I think that shows up a lot. And so let's talk about, because we want to talk about how do we move past this from an organizational standpoint. But there's another piece that I think is super important before we go there. You talk about plagiarized programming as it comes to our story. Say more about that.
So plagiarized programming, if you think of what plagiarism is, and we all know that like if you do plagiarism in college, like you get kicked out. So plagiarism is highly frowned upon, and yet we do it all the time with our belief systems and our stories. And everything, every thought you think, every feeling you feel is a programmed belief system where there, at some point, typically in the imprint period between 0 and 7, which is 95% of our subconscious programming, that programming was adopted in order to have us survive, stay safe, feel in control, and feel loved and accepted. So plagiarized programming is looking at what are those beliefs that you're holding that have created a meaning or an identity or a causality in your life where you believe, if I do this, then that means that. Does it? Does it always? No, that's based on past programming. So same with beliefs of meaning. I am great with money. I suck with money. I'm great at my job. I suck at my job. All of those are belief systems of identity, meaning, and that are typically rooted in the past, and where somewhere along the line, those are accepted. So maybe at one point you had a boss who was constantly sending you emails and saying, hey, like sending you grammatical corrections. And then so that suddenly puts into your mind like, oh, I'm not a good writer. So when you're supposed to write a proposal, like you have this fear and this anxiety that comes up when you're trying to write this proposal because of that one boss that you had, that because of the belief of causality, because of the cause and sequence of events that happen, You established a meaning in your mind that because you just sometimes had some grammatical errors in your emails that you weren't a good writer. Is that necessarily true? No, not necessarily. There's always Grammarly that can fix that. But like being able to look at what are these beliefs that we've adopted? So like, for example, I had one client who was in, quite frankly, it was a very toxic environment with her former boss. Like the former boss did get investigated by HR. So
Whoop. That would be toxic. Yeah.
it wasn't a really good relationship, but there was also, I said, we can't control other people. Like we have to look at what is within our scope of control. And the only person we ever have agency over, that we ever have control over, is ourselves and how we're responding to the situation. And so the common theme that started to come up was in this relationship that she was accepting, because she still was holding down her job. She still was keeping her job. She wasn't going out and looking for more jobs. She was accepting the toxicity of this relationship. Through the course of working together, she did end up changing jobs. She did end up getting a massive pay raise and getting vacation days and getting time off to spend time doing doctor's visits, which she wasn't allowed to do in this situation with this boss. But through that, she realized that the problem wasn't that she could solve, was not necessarily the problem with the boss, because you can't fix somebody else. It was the problem with how she was using her voice and how she was accepting of herself and how she was inviting in toxicity and drama into her own sphere of influence and allowing that to berate her and victimize her. And once we started shifting the stories around what it meant to speak up, what it meant to use her voice, how she could be of service, how she could shift from being that victim to being the creator. And she started to create new circumstances and new opportunities. Even with the toxic boss, she started to create new opportunities with the people below her. And in that space, she then it then created this ripple effect to where the boss was investigated by HR and the circumstances changed. But it wouldn't have changed had she not changed the story inside of herself that she was a victim and powerless.
It reminds me of, this is years and years ago, precursor to me ever doing a coaching training or certification. And it was like in a group development type of program. And I still remember it to this day. Now my husband, he was then my boyfriend, we were sitting there, and I still remember there was someone, I don't remember what she was sharing. It does not even matter, but she was talking about something, and the facilitator was interacting with her, and the facilitator very lovingly, but very clearly and directly said to her, well, it's simple. You're comfortable standing in sewage. And that has always stuck with me, of like, oh, hell no, I'm not going to. And so like when you find yourself stuck, like I'm going to remove drama from my life. I don't need to be sitting here standing in sewage. Like I have something that I can do about it. Yeah, yep. There's difficult conversations. There's severing relationships. There's putting boundaries. There's whatever, but I agree with all that. So we've been talking a lot about this at an individual level, which is amazing and awesome. But you also look at this at the collective level, the organizational level. And we alluded to that in the very beginning. So talk a little bit about how this idea of being mindful of the plagiarized programming and owning our stories on a collective level shows up.
So in a business, what you're doing is you're co-creating an entity and an ethos, and basically the subconscious structure of an entity, just like creating a person, just like raising a child. So you're building together as a team this entity. And sometimes as things go wrong, you start to create belief systems of, oh, this is just how we've always done it, or where sometimes those belief systems are not effective. And so when we can look and assess the plagiarized programming of like, how do we actually need to innovate? What are the values that we say we have, and what are the values that we're actually embodying? Because values are one of our personal subconscious structures that we filter our information and behavior through, but it's also the values of the corporate entity. Now, pretty much every corporation has like company values, but it doesn't mean that they're actually embodying them and that they're living them at the leadership and employee and customer level. Like if you look at a true value, so let's say, for example, and this is one of ours, if you truly value ownership, in my coaching company, we do not attract a lot of victim mindset people. We typically attract people who are have a high level of personal responsibility, because that is what we as a leadership team do. That's what my team holds themselves accountable to a high level of ownership, where we own our mistakes. We own when we break our own integrity, when we say, oh, you know what? I said I was going to have that project to you, by Monday and it looks like it's actually going to be by Tuesday. I'm so sorry. And we have to own our mistakes. And there is no shame or fault in that. It is just a level of ownership. And so that value is embedded into the ethos, into the entity of the subconscious structure of our coaching company. For some, it may be courage. For some, it may be, oh, we value customer service. But if you're not actively focused on serving each other as a team of support, then the value of customer service, it will not transpire in the way that you would like it to, because it's not being embodied at the institutional level.
I so resonate with what you're sharing because this is work that we also do with organizations. It's people will see through the smoke and mirrors. You can have the words on a website, but here's the thing is even like as a leadership team, if you've done the work and it's so clear to you what this means, if there's not deliberate practices embedded into every fabric, every level, every corner of the organization where people know what that value actually means, that it's not like what are the specific behaviors that embody this and what are the deliberate practices. So I love what, like your value of ownership. We have one around embracing your humanity. And one of the things that we do as a deliberate practice is every Friday we have a team check-in and we have check-ins throughout the week, but our Friday check-in specifically is we look back and like reflect on what was our peak of the week, what was our highlights, etc. And then we have F up Fridays. And it's literally like what's your biggest squiggle, detour, misstep, whatever, and you own it. And then it's what's the learning it brought. And a lot of times our best process improvement come from that. But, to connect it back to the story stuff, if you think about like what you're trying to say about like, this is our purpose and this is our vision and these are our values, that's really an organization trying to tell its story about who it is. But if that's not being lived, that's just like a fairy tale. And then what you find, right, that people come into an organization and they were bought into a story. And if that's not their lived experience, how long are they going to sit in that sewage? How long are they going to sit in that disconnect and be okay with it? Is that fair to say?
That's 100% fair to say. And that's where I think you have to look at the individual level first as to like, why were you accepting of that sewage? Like, what is it in your belief system, your own personal story that where maybe you didn't trust, like you took the job because it had everything logically, but maybe there was something in the interview that you were like, I don't know about that. And it didn't make logical sense. That's where learning how to trust your intuition and your own intuitive guidance compass comes in, because then you suddenly take the job, you bought into the logic of, oh, it has all the things. It's just like with dating, like everything's right on paper, but then suddenly you're in it and then you're like in the relationship with the company and you're like, no, this isn't actually what I signed up for. This is actually what I was thinking it was. And there's a level of expectation. Do you break up or do you go further? And then if there's the fears of breaking up, with the company, then it's like, oh, well, how will that look on my resume? What will that cause people to think about me when they see it or when I have to explain that in a job interview? That's when all of your belief stuff comes up. The same is true of the organization. So what is the story that the organization is saying? And then how can you as a leader be able to really look into how your story aligns and matches with that organizational story? And is it one that's that's fighting for the customer? Is it one that is really embracing the humanity? And like, if so, how can you as an active participant in the organization choose to bring out that value through you as an individual?
So, if as an individual or an organization, so let's just talk about getting out of alignment. Luckily, I mean, I literally have my values and behaviors. They're like sitting next to my computer. And I always talk about like ground yourselves in them before you go about your day, ground yourselves in them multiple times, especially if you have to have a hard thing like, how do I want to show up? There's this version of me that's in alignment. There's this version of me that shows up that I want to go, ugh, I'm doing that, right? And as an organization, in theory, we have that stuff too. But if we realize individually or collectively that we have gotten out of alignment with ourselves, or as an organization, we've gotten out of alignment with our brand and our business and who we want to be, what are some practical, tactical steps we can take to get back into alignment?
So first, it's being candidly kind and being able to have that moment of like, you know what, we're not in alignment with what we're preaching. and it's not, it's taking ownership. Like everything just personally takes with ownership and collectively starts with ownership. It starts with taking personal accountability and responsibility for the fact that there were the F ups along the way, the tiny little nudges that moved you off course away from your North Star. Once you are able to own it, and ownership is not blame. It's not pointing the finger and saying, oh, you did this, or, it was this project and we never should have taken it. No, that's not ownership. Ownership is actually, it has a neutral energy around it, because it's not, I'm the bad guy for leading this organization astray. And it's not, I'm the victim. The clients we chose were horrible this year and whatnot. It's a space of neutrality where there is absolute just 100% acceptance for it is what it is right now. And in that space of neutrality and acceptance, that's where you can actually create change. And so how do you get back in alignment? Once you have that space of energetic alignment and neutrality, how do you get back in alignment? How do you refocus on your values and look from the top down? Like, start with personal leadership. How does each individual need to start leading themselves differently? How does each individual need to start leading in a way that is in alignment with what the values are that you're preaching? Or are those values even still the most highest and best, most aligned values for where the trajectory and the vision that you have for the organization, and the trajectory and vision that you have for your individual life? And from there, looking at that alignment piece of like, are these values really in alignment? Like, is this really what we want to be preaching? And if so, then there's the course correction. And if not, then you get to discover, well, what is it that we would like to bring forth that we haven't brought forth? Sometimes it's a doubling down on a principle or a value. Sometimes it's a completely different value. Like when we branched off, I've had my coaching company for 8 years, working with amazing visionary CEOs and leaders and entrepreneurs. And then we started doing podcast guesting as a form of lead generation, started a coaching program around that. And then I started to realize this is a completely separate entity, and they needed to break up. They needed to separate. And the values for our podcast guesting agency, Communication Queens, are different than the values that we have for Crown Yourself. And that's okay, because the values for Communication Queens are really rooted in standing out in your authentic voice, owning your authentic story. It's not as much ownership 100% period like we have in our coaching company. And those are for different reasons, and they manifest differently. But it's okay to have that realignment and see like, look, these company values are actually what we want. You may not necessarily have to break up with the organization, but the company may need to reevaluate. Like, maybe there's just a deepening. Maybe instead of ownership, there's a reframing or rephraseologying. We just made up a word here. We're going to go with it.
I like it. I like making up words.
of what that word means, or maybe it's a different framing of it. Maybe it's doing what matters. Maybe it is a different way that is the next level evolution of what that value was, that's no longer applicable at the level of where you're going and at the level of where you're at now. And that's why there's been the disconnect. So it's starting with ownership. It's next having that realignment conversation, both with yourself, because I think it does have to happen both on the individual level and on the team level. And then seeing, is everyone in the right seat? Like, are you in the right seat? And now for the entrepreneur, this can look very different than in a corporate setting. But in a corporate setting, sometimes you are in the wrong seat. Sometimes you actually do need to be in more of a leadership position, or maybe you're not ready for that role yet. Maybe you actually need to get some more skills and practice with people management. And that's where you're not in the right seat for where you need to be yet, and you need to learn and grow more.
Well, and I would even build on that, because I have one of our longstanding clients. We're doing a bunch of work this past year with some of their leaders, and with one of them, talk about story, we're working through a self-limiting story that they have around, in this case, it was getting in the way of effectively having growth feedback conversations and calling people to greatness, et cetera. And during the course of our work together, realized that this is what a lot of companies do, right? They have someone who's a good individual contributor. There's an opening in a supervisor position. And so then they promote this person in there, and the person's willing to do it because they care about the company. They have, long-term tenure. It's a bump in pay, all of those things, which is why people, sure. And they realize that it is so not for them. Like they hate it. And now they're struggling. Now they're failing in that role. And what I commend this leader for, though, is recognizing that this person is valued in this organization. We failed this person and put them in the wrong role, and I don't think that they're happy. And this leader was really having a whole bunch of angst around having this conversation. But, I'm like, nope, here you go. It's part of the testing process. You need to have this conversation. When he did it, the other person was so relieved because they're like, I hate this. And I feel like I'm sucking and I feel like I'm failing. And I who wants to come to work every day and feel like, you're incompetent. And they were going to put somebody, basically it was kind of a demotion for him, but back to what he was doing with some additional responsibilities where he could thrive and shine in his sparkle, our works could shine, and put somebody else who just was better aligned. And I think so often we are afraid of having those conversations, but when you think about how do we keep people, and that growing them is not always about moving up into some kind of arbitrary management or leadership role. It's how are you helping them align the work with what lets them shine. So that's why I love, like, you have to have that individual work, but also serves the organization. And I think we get so stuck into, nope, this is the job description, or this is the job task, or this is the org structure. And I think in today's day and age where we still have a competition for talent, as organizations, we have to rethink how we're leveraging talent versus placing them in these, very rigid identities, if you will, versus God, there's a lot that this person could bring. And can we maybe rethink or create a new job description? So I think that I think it's a strategic imperative for organizations to be looking at their story, right? Looking at their values, getting back in integrity. Or the ones that we work with, when they do that work, they find it helps them a lot better when, like, things like pandemic and social justice crisis and things pop up in the world. It makes it easier for them to know, how do we make decisions and how do we know what direction to go versus like floundering and being stuck in the swirl of chaos.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I see it with people who jump ship from corporate and go into entrepreneurship where they were in a role that they did really well. And then they go into starting their own business. And when you start your own business, then you have 25 different roles and you're the one doing all of them. And it's very easy to feel like you suck at it because you're not in the right role. You're in 25 different roles doing all of them, and like delegating it back to where you can be in that space so that you can have your own company, so that you can do the thing that is in your zone of genius. And being able to understand what is your zone of genius, that is one of the biggest ones where you get to strip away a lot of plagiarized programming, because the zone of genius is a space where you just naturally thrive and think in your specific way, and know not everyone thinks and does things like you do, and recognizing that that's your special gift. Because the other zone where people get stuck is in the zone of excellence, and they're praised for certain things, and they are in that space where they can do it. It looks great. It's operating at a high level, but it's not actually lighting them up. And if you want that full level of engagement, that comes with having an engaged and aligned person who's engaged with their gifts, and their story matches that.
One of the things that, speaking of, being able to shine and have our gifts shine, one of the things that I have learned in my work is that we all do get in our own way and dim our sparkle from time to time. And I'm obsessed with normalizing this messiness of being human. And so, since we've had such an awesome conversation about story, and speaking of owning your story, Kimberly, I would love it if you would share, what is a self-limiting story that you still tell yourself sometimes? And when it shows up, how do you move beyond it so that you can still show up as a leader in your life?
The big one that I've noticed coming up recently really is around deserving, because it hit hard, honestly, this past year. And I had a moment of burnout. So like, we had a very intense 3 years. I know the past 3 years, it was not necessarily a picnic for everyone. We moved twice. We moved countries, and we moved states in 1 year. And we lost 3 family members and 2 family friends, including my father. And that experience of completely dysregulating my nervous system, and as of the high achiever that I am, I just kept going. And I had a baby in that time too. So no small feat.
How many massive life changes can you throw in one shot? There we go. Yes.
Pretty much every single one. The only thing I didn't do was get married, get divorced, or like go for a college degree. that like those three, like, darn it. Fortunately, I have the most amazing supportive husband and supportive network, but it doesn't matter how strong your support network is when there's still a story of lack of deserving. So we ended up moving to Texas, manifested our dream home, like, and I had all the shoulds hit me at once. Oh my gosh, I should be happy. I should be grateful. I should be like, I have a great thriving business, started a second one. My kids are healthy, all the shoulds. But I was so dysregulated from just navigating trauma, loss, grief, that suddenly this very old story of deserving, which is a really interesting one because it comes from our world of the just world bias. And the just world bias is that when basically shit hits the fan, stuff happens in your life, and this can be a lot of it can be rooted to childhood trauma, that suddenly there is the villainization of yourself. That nonsense comes from people, our toddler brains, trying to make fairness out of the world. And suddenly I was hit with so much gratitude for everything that I had. Also a feeling of unfairness, of like, just felt unfair that, I lost 3 family members and 2 close friends. Like there was this deep feeling. And so it hit me so hard that I actually ended up getting mono over the summer because my body was just like, you need to rest. So that was a huge piece. But then beyond that, I had to look at like the belief of what I deserved and where this funky belief system came from, this funky story of not deserving great, beautiful, amazing things, like literally manifested my dream, and being able to navigate that dance with the deserving, like, did I earn it? And that those feelings and that story of earning is very deeply rooted subconsciously. So that's one that I'm still working through. And I've worked through it so many times on so many different levels. I'd worked through it with my body. I worked through it with relationships. I worked through it with money. So I know I'm going to get to the other side of it. It's still working the same process of reevaluating, realigning, and then recalibrating my entire body to a new level.
I so appreciate all that because I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is those self-limiting stories, they show up over and over and over, and they manifest themselves in different, contexts. I love your transparency and authenticity of sharing that, but also the realization, like, as you're talking about them, like, "Oh, yeah, I can think of times where it's like, I think when you hold yourself back, it's like, 'Do I deserve this?' Or maybe I shouldn't," or whatnot. So I think that's a very common one. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
All right. Are you ready for quick questions?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. Fill in the blank. Living authentically is.
Love.
What is something people would be surprised to know about you?
When I was 24, I wrote a screenplay when I was 21 that I co-wrote it with a director, and it got picked up, starred Danny Trejo, and is a high-flying, hard-partying freestyle motocross movie that got picked up by Lionsgate and is on Netflix, called Bro.
Shut the front door, bro. Okay. That is fabulous. I love that. Okay. All right. What's your go-to song?
Ooh, Come Alive from The Greatest Showman.
Oh, I like that one. I like that one. All right. What's something you can't live without?
My kids.
What is something in your ordinary daily life that makes your heart happy?
Being able to sit on our porch and overlook and watch our donkeys and goats mosey on through their day with a hot cup of coffee or tea.
And just pause there. Our donkeys and goats. Like, I love that sentence so much. I can't even tell you. And what are you grateful for right now?
Being alive. Being alive today, having been blessed with this day to serve and to show up. And I'm so grateful for the level of reverence that I have for life right now, because I've seen how quickly it can go.
All right, closing question. Kimberly, if you could challenge leaders everywhere to practice this one behavior that would create more human workplaces and equip everyone to show up as a leader, what would that be?
Integrity. Are you doing what you say you're going to do? Do you keep your commitments both to yourself and to others? Do you honor the things that you say that you're going to be going for? Whether it's, having that side hustle, writing a fiction novel, or doing those dreams that were placed in your heart? Are you in alignment and practicing integrity with your higher self who is giving you these gifts of creative inspiration, whether in new ways of leadership or in how to show up for your team? Are you in integrity with yourself?
I, as a fellow Sparkle sister, I am so appreciative of this conversation, and I think there's so much richness in it. So thank you for bringing us back to the power of story, power of authenticity, individually and collectively, and just really, really appreciative.
Thank you so much, Rosie, for having me. It has been such an honor to be here with you and your amazing audience. I am so grateful for you and all your sparkle.
I'm Rosie Ward, and this is Show Up as a Leader. To learn more, head over to peopleforwardnetwork.com and, of course, hit that follow button.